Hello and welcome to today's Medicinal Monday on the Alter Your Health podcast. I'm Dr. Susanna Alter.
And I'm Dr. Ben.
And we're both naturopathic doctors who empower individuals to heal themselves through whole food plant-based nutrition and mind-body medicine.
So welcome to another episode of the podcast. We're excited to talk about the throat today and, the issues that go wrong with the throat and how to prevent and reverse those issues, and specifically sore throats and upper respiratory infections. I mean, there's more nuanced things that can be, going on with the throat and like vocal cords and all sorts of funky stuff that we hear about. But in general, when people think about the throat, it's really just that acute sore throat, which might make its way into a generalized upper respiratory infection. And by the way, that is the quote unquote common cold. So yeah, we're going to be talking about really things to consider to prevent that, but also heal and treat that and relate with that naturally. And I guess before we even dive in, I think it's just so helpful to understand that these quote unquote acute infections, or like, a cold, flu, just kind of that being sick, quote unquote. A lot of people have this relationship with it, like there's something wrong, and like they did something wrong, they caught something. But in fact, human beings, and to my knowledge, like all creatures, get sick, quote unquote, and that's an opportunity for their immune systems to adapt and evolve. And I like to think about immunity as kind of being like a muscle. If we live in a sterilized environment and aren't exposed to things, then that muscle of the immune system kind of atrophies. So mounting an immune response and allowing our bodies to recover from these acute upper respiratory infections, cold, flu, etc., is, or at least very much can be, a very healthy thing to allow our bodies to do.
Definitely.
And I just think about, some of the research around, for example, some acute, childhood illnesses. I think there's some studies around measles, for example, and people who have had measles, which of course most people are now vaccinated against or immunized against actually ever getting the infection. But people who do get that infection have a lower risk of different cancers, various cancers later on in their life. So that allows their immune systems to balance out and strengthen to prevent a lot of other chronic conditions. So getting acutely ill, long story short, getting quote unquote acutely ill and allowing our bodies to, overcome these acute illnesses can be very much helpful in preventing longer term chronic illnesses.
Yeah. And so, when we're talking about kind of the frequency, like what's normal in terms of getting sick with one of these upper respiratory infections, these, mild upper respiratory infections, it's not abnormal, like you're saying, for people to get sick, for healthy people to get sick once or twice a year. And actually, if someone goes, 2 years or so, even longer, without getting one of those colds, it can actually be a sign that their immune system might be a little bit suppressed, that they're not really mounting, a strong immune response to the viruses that they're interfacing with. Of course, perhaps it could also mean that the person's really sheltering themselves and, not exposing themselves to the diversification of the ever evolving and shifting microbiome that is in the world that we live in.
Right. So that's kind of the bigger picture, how we relate to these, common colds and acute upper respiratory infections. But of course, maybe, stepping back a little bit and talking about the throat, talking about the mouth, that's where we're at in our journey of altering your health from head to toe. I guess, maybe just a little brief anatomy, physiology, with regard to like the immune system that lives in our mouth and throat. We know that the health of our mucous membranes is so important for, being that first line of defense against toxins, against pathogens. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about the mouth in this series on the podcast. A lot of people have questions that go over our head in terms of like, oral health and dental health. Obviously, that's for dentists. But, we do know that our microbiome of our mouth is really important, and avoiding, antibiotics in terms of antiseptic mouthwashes and these sort of things that disrupt our oral microbiome on a regular basis can interfere with that immune system that lives in our mouth and is the first line of defense. And of course, the other thing that comes into play with our the health of our mucous membranes in our mouth and our throat is just like hydration and just a low inflammatory load. Essentially not bombarding these cells with a bunch of toxins and just kind of putting a strain on their function on a regular basis. Just nourishing.
Yeah. No, on that hydration piece,
Yeah.
because you brought it up, I just want to mention it's really interesting. People think that, if I go on the airplane, I'm more likely to get sick because I'm crowded in a small place with a bunch of other people. But actually, it's more likely if you get sick from, traveling, it's more likely due to the fact that the airplanes are extremely, extremely dry. I mean, the air, the environment is very dry into the mucous membranes.
And then you're given like a shot of water every 2 hours.
Exactly. Or maybe you're limiting your water intake because you don't want to have to bother your neighbor to go up and go to the bathroom or whatever it is. But many people end up being very dehydrated on flights. And when our mucous membranes become dehydrated, then we're more vulnerable to actually being invaded by whatever kind of viruses might be circulating in the air.
Yeah.
So that's why staying hydrated while we travel is actually the biggest thing you could do to really support preventing getting one of these infections.
And then of course, just while we're on the topic of prevention, we don't need to harp on the fact that general nutritional status is super important. We can, of course, think of things like vitamin C and zinc and quercetin and all of these, therapeutic nutrients to help not only prevent, but also treat acute respiratory infections and whatnot. But just general repletion with vitamins and minerals and nutrients is so helpful for proper immune function. But maybe more important than that is not putting an excessive strain on the immune system by ingesting toxins, by ingesting, pathogenic bacteria, from our meat, dairy, and eggs and animal products that can be contaminated and kind of contaminating our kitchen environment, our cooking space and whatnot. And that kind of perpetual disruption of the microbiome can put a strain on our immune system as well. So yeah, that's, from my perspective, just kind of some common sense things about just, eating well, sleeping well, hydrating well, doing all the things that we need for just basic immune function. Anything else to add in terms of prevention of
Well, that
these
was
kind
a
of
really kind of quick overview, and I feel like we could talk in great depth about all sorts of stuff we could do for supporting the immune system and preventing frequent infections.
Yeah.
But I think, since
there's more to cover.
We can move on.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we've just recorded so many podcasts that have talked about the immune system.
It's true.
It's like, vitamin C, zinc, all of our vitamins and minerals and nutrients and hydration and sleep and stress and just all these things. But I want
and I want to say also, it's the kind of mindset around prevention of upper respiratory infections. I know there are times when we might be living with someone who came down with something and we really want to ramp up our prevention, right? But for the most part, prevention of these common colds should really just be a daily healthy lifestyle. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, we talked about that if we get fewer than 1 or 2 colds a year, what that could mean. But sometimes people get they get sick all the time. They get sick with every single thing that comes around, and that's also a sign of an imbalanced immune system and possibly also an imbalanced lifestyle, most likely, right?
Yeah. So that suppressed immune system just creates more vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to talk about how there is no cure for the common cold. and why there is no cure for the common cold. And you know, I feel like I've heard it said in a very beautiful way that like the illness is not the problem, or oh my gosh, now I'm gonna really chop it up, but the symptoms that we experience are our body's answer to the problem, not the problem themselves. And this is very much exemplified in the case of a common cold. And it's like of course, the conventional paradigm is like, how can we treat these symptoms? How can we treat the symptoms of the stuffy nose and the scratchy throat and the swollen tonsils and the body aches and the fever? But those symptoms are evidence of our body kind of regaining balance. So those symptoms are not something that we need to treat, but just kind of listen to and allow to express themselves and complete that process of some people say detoxification. One theory, I guess, to bring up is that these cold like illnesses and upper respiratory infections are simply not only an opportunity for our immune system to adapt and evolve and up level and upgrade, but also for the body to cleanse and detoxify itself, from phlegm and mucus and other bodily secretions and whatnot. So we want to support that process rather than suppress that process. So that's just one really, I think, kind of mindset shift to how we can relate to quote unquote getting sick, because we're not really getting sick. We're getting healthy. And this is our body's process of getting more healthy. So on the other side of like acute illness is more health when we allow ourselves to go through it, rather than less health if we suppress those and push those symptoms down. Because in doing that, in pushing those symptoms down, we're also just pushing down the vital force of our bodies. So we want to allow the expression rather than the suppression of the symptoms.
Definitely. And in the case of the throat here, if we focus on the throat in the case of the upper respiratory infection, that sore, inflamed throat is the immune response. It's inflammation in the throat. And we think of inflammation as bad, but inflammation is the immediate healing response uh, towards a pathogen, a foreign invader. And so when we have that inflamed throat, we have inflamed mucosa, really what we're bringing is fresh blood to the area. And there might be an increase in the production of mucus. You might be clearing your throat. You might have mucus in your nasal membranes as well. But that's a good thing because that mucus contains white blood cells that'll help fight the infection. And so, yeah, it really is a mindset shift. Like when people get a sore throat, usually the response is, oh man, no, I'm sick, I'm broken. Why am I sick? I did something wrong. But that sore throat is actually a sign that your body is working perfectly in response to whatever it happens to be exposed to.
Right. So just that energy of trust, also, just that trust and peace that comes with knowing what our body is doing for us in and of itself really supports the healing response as well. I think maybe we can talk a little bit, since it's kind of been talked around already, the whole germ idea, virus idea versus terrain idea. I will just say that, I don't discredit the presence of viruses in the world, even though I do know a lot of people are questioning the reality of whether or not viruses even exist. I do think that viruses, it's interesting to consider that viruses, even in our kind of conventional understanding of them, it's essentially just like a snippet of genetic material. It's not a living creature. It's not a living being. The genetic material, again, from like virology, kind of this conventional understanding of virology, is that this little snippet of genetic material requires a host in order to recreate and reproduce and kind of then create symptoms in that host. So it's interesting to consider that what back to kind of the world that we're living in, and like people that quote unquote get sick, and this whole idea that we can spread sickness between one person and another. I mean, we've been in a house with 7 or 8 or 10 people for the last few weeks, and people have been sick, and some people get sick and some people don't. And actually, I got symptoms myself just yesterday. And
But I haven't gotten
but
any.
but Susanna hasn't. Sometimes it's the other way.
Right.
And it's like, well, the way that I like to talk about kind of germ theory versus terrain theory is just how understanding terrain just helps us understand our objective observation of the facts that we witness in reality. Because if germ theory was the dogma that actually guided, objective reality, then everyone would be sick when there's a germ. And that's never the case. There is always a terrain, and there is always an environment of that host that can be that is very much an important player in whether or not any sort of potential germ can cause symptoms.
So, Ben, do you want to explain, because you have been using the terms germ theory and terrain theory, do you want to just define those real quickly for those who aren't familiar with them?
Sure. I mean, germ theory is the theory that germs cause illness. Terrain theory is the theory that germs don't cause illness, and it's really the terrain of a host that is the most important role in whether or not illness is experienced.
So, to put it in a different way, perhaps, terrain theory recognizes that viruses and bacteria and fungi are all present in our environment, but that exposure to a bacteria or virus doesn't necessarily mean someone is going to get sick, because it takes into account the overall terrain. It takes into
Yeah.
account how balanced all the components that make up a person's terrain are. And the more balanced, the more resilient the terrain is, the more we can be exposed to these quote unquote pathogenic organisms, and simply, not express those symptoms
Right.
that
And
are attributed
I
to
I would say
an
again,
infection.
yeah, I would say again that I believe a lot of terrain theorists don't believe that viruses exist. I think bacteria and fungi, that's a different thing, because bacteria and fungi can actually be visualized and with an electron microscope and stuff. Um, but the presence of viruses is like up for debate. It seems like in a lot of communities, but regardless, my perspective, my personal perspective is, regardless of what's kind of quote unquote making you sick, whether it's a germ or just this vulnerability of terrain, the answer and the treatment is always to bolster our self-healing potential. And whether that the cause of that is a toxin, whether you call it glyphosate or an herbicide or a pesticide, or heavy metal, or whether you call it Epstein-Barr virus, or whether you call it mononucleosis, or whether you call it herpes, or whether you call it Lyme, or whether you call it anything, it doesn't matter what you call it. The way that we go about treating it and allowing our bodies to heal naturally has to do with fortifying our foundation of health and really supporting the body in kind of coming back into balance naturally. So, I think that it's kind of silly how people kind of get wrapped up in the nuances of like the microscopic world of what's going at, what's at the quote unquote root of the issue, when practically speaking, for you and I and people, living on planet Earth and just kind of taking care of ourselves, that doesn't really matter. What matters is that we're just equipped and empowered to create that foundation of health. And, the way that I like to put it is just kind of remove the toxicity from our life, remove the toxicity from our food, air, water, and life, and fortify the nutritional status, remove any, potential deficiency as well. So, remove toxicity and correct any deficiency, and then our bodies have what they need to reestablish health.
Right. And then, of course, on Wednesday, we're going to talk a lot more about how our nervous system plays a huge role into terrain as well.
Sure.
And so we won't give that away right now, but I just wanted to really recognize or address here that sometimes the biggest obstacle that's throwing someone's terrain off balance is, chronic stress, is a chronically overactivated nervous system.
Sure,
So
totally. And to back to my experience of quote unquote getting sick in the last couple of days, I think that my state of mind had a huge role in it. Absolutely. I think maybe the role, because I was eating pretty well, drinking good water and everything. So anyway,
yeah, definitely.
so now we can kind of wrap up by talking about strategies for dealing with these symptoms, because
Yeah.
of course they're not pleasant. I just had them, so I'm fresh with ideas and practical understanding of the importance and power of these natural healing strategies. And of course, at the top of the list is just kind of being replete with our vitamins and minerals and nutrients, so not having any nutritional deficiency to begin with, which goes back to prevention of just eating well, staying hydrated, etc. But even though I was eating well, hydrated, etc., there's always room for kind of like, the super physiologic dosages of this and that. And whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, along with food, this is definitely a period where, you wouldn't want to like go overboard with the coconut bliss ice cream or the whole food plant-based cookies or whatever it is.
Maybe that's why I got sick. Susanna insisted on getting some coconut bliss ice creams, and then I got sick like 2
Really,
days
you're
later.
blaming it on the coconut bliss ice cream. But yeah, so especially when symptoms manifest, if you're sick, it's a time to really kind of clean up the diet, hone in on really good nutrition, taking out any dietary obstacles, focusing on great hydration. But yes, talking about what nutrients, what herbs we might be able to bring in to really expedite the healing from a sore throat or upper respiratory infection.
So I think that zinc and then some zinc ionophore compound constituent is really helpful, kind of at the top of the list. So zinc, we like liquid zinc, where you can kind of like ramp up the dose and kind of monitor the dose more accurately. I don't know. Liquid zinc is great. And then something like quercetin or a quinine supplement. We like kind of the lemon grapefruit peel extract of quinine, which is really effective in kind of having not only antiviral, antiparasitic, antimicrobial properties, but having that ability to kind of push zinc where it needs to be in the cell to activate immune system to, do all the things that we need.
Right. Quinine is a constituent that's found in lots of food, but particularly the peel of citrus. And so to make this, citrus peel extract, it's literally just boiling citrus peel and water. And you were drinking, a couple tablespoons of that. And so that's a really big one. And of course, vitamin C is a great one whenever you want to boost your immune function. So is vitamin D.
Yeah.
You can actually increase your vitamin D dosing when you're acutely ill to just really kind of help boost that immune system temporarily. And
then maybe we should have started like before that, are things like hydrotherapy, for a sore throat. I didn't do this because my throat wasn't that achy or sore, but doing like a cold wrap, a warming compress around the throat. So a cold towel around the throat and then wrapped with a warm sweater, and that brings fresh circulation, blood flow to the throat to kind of remove waste and stimulate healing in that way. And then for a fever, which I did kind of have a little bit of a fever, a great thing to do to support the proper boosting of the body temperature, because a fever, remember, is kind of one way that the immune system activates to kind of burn off any toxin or virus or pathogen. So that mounting that fever response, things that can help with that are things like a nice hot bath, getting the body temperature up. And then after the hot bath, last night I put on a cold t-shirt, a cold damp t-shirt, and then bundled up in a wool sweater in that kind of wet t-shirt. Therapeutic application of hydrotherapy is a good way to kind of pump fresh blood to the core of my body, while also raising my core body temperature to kind of burn off that infection again.
Yeah, hydrotherapy is hugely helpful in speeding up the recovery process from an acute illness.
So, and we didn't we? Oh no, I'm thinking of something else. But so it's been a while since we've done a hydrotherapy podcast,
but we certainly have at least one, probably two.
But in addition to the wet t-shirt, something that I didn't have any wool socks, but the warming sock application as well is really great with the wet t-shirt for URIs and whatnot.
Yeah. And then we can think about botanicals that are helpful for modulating the immune system, and definitely the ones that come to mind most quickly are echinacea, elderberry, golden seal or hydrastis. That's that antimicrobial effect.
Berberine,
berberine also has that antimicrobial effect. And then there's, of course, respiratory herbs that can, kind of help clear out mucus and do this and do that. But we generally focus more on really just, supporting the immune system, because the body knows how to clear out that infection when we take good care of it and when we're supporting the immune system.
And I guess maybe as a little wrap up segment, where I think next week we'll probably talk about the lungs and the lower respiratory tract.
Or maybe the thyroid.
Okay. Fine. But I think that, obviously the intention of kind of healing our acute upper respiratory infection is to prevent a lower respiratory infection, something like pneumonia, which can be certainly more problematic. So we want to keep that stuff going up rather than going down in our body.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So that's the intention of all these acute treatments and remedies, to keep it going up rather than going down. So yeah.
Those are our favorites. I will say, if someone has a very, very sore throat and they're really just wanting to alleviate that soreness, like raw honey in some water can be really soothing. So can throat coat tea.
Of course. Oh yeah, of course.
With some licorice and demulcent herbs in there, like slippery elm, can be very coating.
Gargling with salt water, warm salt water, can be soothing and kind of antimicrobial as well.
Yes.
And I forgot to mention, like, maybe it's worth saying that, things like strep throat, which is a bacterial infection of the throat, exists, and that is another thing, right?
Oh yeah. Well, no, there's strep throat. There's mono. There's chronic sore throat due to allergies and postnasal drip.
But I just brought that.
STIs that can cause sore throat. There's mold allergies that can cause.
I just brought that up because sometimes like the quote unquote the treatment, even the natural treatment, can be different. Because like when we're addressing a bacterial infection, it's a little bit different. And maybe that, a lot of times when we go to the conventional doctor, especially for kiddos, it's like the treatment is just antibiotics, right? Even though there's no bacterial infection. So of course we want to avoid that unless it might be necessary. Just throwing it out there, like more quote unquote antibiotic. That doesn't have to be conventional pharmaceutical antibiotics, but more antibacterial treatments can be indicated.
Right.
So I guess that's enough ramble.
Yes. So I guess we'll wrap things up and remind you all that if you're looking for more comprehensive support, please check out our Thrive on Plants program at our website. Also, if you're just looking for some inspiration around meal prep and maybe just a little bit of support, not like comprehensive support, check out our weekly meal guide membership, which includes a monthly support call for all of our members as well. So just go over to our website, alter.health. And you can learn more. Speaking of throat, need to clear my throat.
That's healthy too,
And Wednesday we'll be talking so much more about the energetic mind-body or brain-body connection.
Susanna's looking forward to that.
Yes.
All right. Peace and love, you guys. See you next time.
Bye for now.